The screaming stopped at exactly 3:13 in the morning on November 15, 1856, but Dr. Samuel Whitmore knew something had gone terribly wrong. He stood frozen in the doorway of the Harper farmhouse bedroom watching as Constance Harper held not one but 3 perfectly identical newborns, each breathing in perfect synchronization, their tiny chests rising and falling as if controlled by a single invisible thread. The oil lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows across the blood-soaked sheets. But what made his hands shake was not the mess of childbirth, but the way the 3 babies turned their heads toward him at the exact same moment, their dark eyes reflecting the flame like tiny mirrors. 27 years of delivering babies in rural Morrow, County Ohio had never prepared him for this. Constance lay pale as winter snow, her auburn hair matted with sweat as she whispered the same words over and over in a voice that did not sound like her own. They came from the same dream, she kept saying. They came from the same dream. Her husband Thomas stood pressed against the far wall, his weathered farmer hands trembling as he clutched his suspenders, his face twisted with something between wonder and absolute terror. The babies had been born within minutes of each other. But that was not what chilled Dr. Whitmore to his core. It was the fact that each child bore an identical birthmark, shaped like a crescent moon, positioned in the exact same spot behind their left ear. It was the way they cried, in perfect harmony, stopping and starting as one voice. It was the way they seemed to track movement with an intelligence that newborns simply did not possess, their eyes following the doctor as he moved around the room. But most disturbing of all was the way Constance kept insisting she had only been pregnant with one child. Her belly had been normal-sized for a single birth throughout the entire 9 months. The midwife who had examined her just 2 weeks prior, Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, had confirmed only one heartbeat using her experienced ear pressed against the swollen stomach. Thomas had felt only one baby kicking. The cradle he had carved from Ohio oak was built for one child, yet here lay 3 perfect children, identical down to the smallest detail, as if they had been carved from the same piece of living marble, their features so exact that Dr. Whitmore could not tell them apart, even under the bright lamplight. Thomas finally found his voice breaking the eerie silence that had settled over the room. "Doctor, what does this mean?" he whispered. "How is this possible?" Dr. Whitmore had no answer. In all his years studying medicine at Cincinnati College, he had never read of such a phenomenon. Twins, yes, occasionally triplets, but never had he encountered children born so perfectly identical that they seemed like reflections of each other. Outside, the November wind howled through the bare branches of the oak trees that surrounded the Harper farmstead, carrying with it whispers that seemed to come from another world entirely. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since midnight, and frost was already forming on the windows, despite the fire crackling in the hearth. The babies fell silent, all at once. All 3 turned their heads toward the window at the exact same moment, as if responding to some sound that only they could hear. Their dark eyes seemed to be watching something in the darkness beyond the glass. Dr. Whitmore followed their gaze, but saw only the swaying shadows of leafless trees against the starless sky. And in that moment he understood that something ancient and terrible had awakened in the hills of Ohio, something that had been waiting patiently beneath the rich farmland for the right moment to return. The feeling crept up his spine like ice water. These children were not meant to be. They were something else entirely. Something that wore the mask of human babies, but carried within them a purpose that he could not begin to comprehend. Constance began to speak again, but this time her voice carried a strange resonance, as if multiple people were talking through her throat. "The mirror showed me 3 faces," she said. 3 faces, but one soul. 3 bodies, but one mind. Thomas backed further against the wall, his face draining of all color. "What mirror?" he asked. "What are you talking about?" But Constance did not seem to hear him. Her eyes had taken on a glazed, distant look, as if she were seeing something far beyond the walls of their bedroom. "The old mirror in the basement," she continued, "the one that came with the house. It showed me what was coming. It showed me the truth." Dr. Whitmore felt his medical training desert him completely. This was beyond science, beyond anything he had learned in his years of practice. These children defied every law of nature, he knew. As if reading his thoughts, all 3 babies turned to look directly at him once more. Their eyes held an ancient wisdom that made his soul recoil in terror, and somewhere in the distance, barely audible above the wind, he could swear he heard the sound of something laughing. By dawn on November 16, 1856, the news had spread through Cardington like wildfire, but nobody wanted to believe it. 3 identical babies born to a woman who had carried only one child, Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, the midwife who had tended to women in these parts for over 40 years, stood in her kitchen staring at her reflection in the window, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching her from the tree line. She had delivered thousands of babies, but never had she felt the presence that filled the Harper house that night, something cold and calculating that seemed to press against her very soul. The coffee in her cup had gone cold hours ago, but she could not bring herself to move. Outside her window, the morning mist clung to the ground like grasping fingers refusing to lift, even as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Her neighbor, Jacob Morrison, had stopped by at first light, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Eleanor," he had said, "is it true what they are saying about the Harper babies?" She had nodded, unable to find words to explain what she had witnessed. 3 children born from one womb, each breathing as if they shared the same lungs. Jacob had shaken his head and walked away, muttering prayers under his breath. But Eleanor knew that prayers would not help them now. Something had been set in motion, something that had been waiting in the dark places of the world for centuries. She remembered the stories her grandmother used to tell, stories of the old country before the settlers came, stories of spirits that could split souls into pieces and scatter them like seeds in fertile ground. The Shawnee had called this land cursed long before the first white families arrived. They had spoken of mirrors that showed not reflections but truths too terrible for human eyes to witness. Eleanor had dismissed such tales as superstition. Now she was not so sure. She walked to her medicine cabinet and pulled out a small leather journal where she recorded every birth she attended. Her hands shook as she wrote the date. November 15th, 1856, Harper Triplets. She wrote, then stopped. How could she explain what had happened? How could she put into words the way those babies had looked at her with eyes that belonged to something far older than newborn children? She set down her pen and walked to the window again. The mist was finally starting to clear, and she could see the path that led through the woods to the Harper farm. That was when she saw them. 3 figures standing at the edge of the tree line, perfectly still, perfectly identical. Even from a distance, she could tell they were watching her house. Her blood turned to ice as she realized they were the same height, the same build, wearing identical dark clothing. She blinked and looked again. The figures were gone, but the feeling of being watched remained stronger than ever. Eleanor grabbed her shawl and headed for the door. She had to see those babies again. She had to understand what was happening before it was too late. The walk to the Harper farm normally took 20 minutes, but today the path seemed longer, as if the woods themselves were trying to keep her away. The trees whispered overhead, though there was no wind to move their branches. Every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. Every sound made her heart race faster. When she finally reached the farmhouse, she found Thomas Harper sitting on his front porch, his head in his hands. The man, who had always been strong and sure of himself, looked broken, defeated. "Thomas," she called out, "how are the babies?" He looked up at her with eyes that held no hope. "They do not sleep, Eleanor," he said. "They do not cry. They just lie there watching everything, with those eyes. And Constance, she keeps talking about mirrors, about things she sees that are not there." Eleanor felt her stomach drop. "Where is Dr. Whitmore?" "Gone," he said. "Left before sunrise. Said he had other patients to tend, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He knows something is wrong, just like we do." Eleanor climbed the porch steps, her legs feeling like lead. Inside the house, she could hear a strange humming sound. Not singing exactly, but something more primal, more unsettling. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. Thomas stood up slowly. "There is something else," he said. "Something I have not told anyone." Eleanor waited, feeling the weight of whatever truth he was about to share. "The babies, they do not just look identical," he whispered. "They move identical. When one raises its hand, the others do the same. When one turns its head, the others follow." It is as if they are all connected somehow, all controlled by the same mind. Eleanor felt the pieces of a terrible puzzle beginning to fall into place. The mirror. Constance mentioned. She said, "Where is it?" Thomas pointed toward the back of the house, in the cellar. He said, "Been there since we bought this place. The previous owners left it behind. Said they did not want it anymore." Eleanor knew she had. To see that mirror had to understand what Constance had witnessed as she walked toward the cellar door. The humming sound grew louder, and she could swear she heard 3 voices joining together in perfect harmony, singing something that sounded like a lullaby, but the words were in no language she had ever heard. The cellar door creaked open like the mouth of a tomb, revealing stone steps that descended into absolute darkness. Eleanor Blackwood held her oil lamp high as she made her way down each footstep, echoing in the confined space like a funeral drum. The humming sound grew stronger down here, vibrating through the walls and into her bones. At the bottom of the steps, she found herself in a small basement with rough stone walls and a dirt floor, and there against the far wall stood the mirror. It was enormous, nearly 7 feet tall and 4 feet wide, framed in black wood, that seemed to absorb the lamplight rather than reflect it. The surface was not clear glass but something darker, something that seemed to move and shift like liquid mercury. Eleanor approached, slowly, feeling every instinct in her body screaming at her to turn and run. But she had to know, she had to understand what Constance Harper had seen in this cursed thing. As she drew closer, the humming suddenly stopped. The silence was worse than the sound had been. She raised her lamp and looked into the mirror, expecting to see her own reflection. Instead, she saw 3 identical women standing side by side. All 3 had her face, her gray hair, her weathered hands, but their eyes were different, ancient and knowing, and filled with a malevolence that made her soul recoil. 3 reflections smiled at her in perfect unison. Eleanor stumbled backward but could not look away. One of the reflections raised its hand and pointed directly at her. The other 2 began to laugh silently, their mouths opening and closing, but no sound emerging. That was when Eleanor understood. The mirror did not show reflections. It showed possibilities. It showed what could be, what might be, what was meant to be. And somehow it had shown Constance Harper 3 versions of the child she carried. 3 identical souls born from one body. But something had gone wrong with the process. Instead of creating 3 separate children, the mirror had split one soul into 3 pieces. Each baby carried only a fragment of what should have been whole, and those fragments were trying to reunite. Eleanor heard footsteps on the stairs behind her. Thomas Harper appeared in the lamplight, his face pale and drawn. "Eleanor, what are you doing down here?" She turned to him, unable to speak. In the mirror behind her, the 3 reflections had been replaced by something else. 3 baby shapes floating in darkness, all identical, all watching, all waiting. Thomas followed her gaze to the mirror and let out a cry of horror. "What is that thing?" Eleanor found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "It is what created your children," she said. "It is what split their soul into pieces, and I think it wants them back above them." The sound of crying began, 3 voices wailing in perfect harmony. But the sound was not coming from the babies upstairs. It was coming from the mirror itself. Thomas grabbed Eleanor by the arm. "We have to get out of here," he said. "We have to take the babies and leave this place." But Eleanor knew it was already too late. Whatever had been set in motion could not be stopped. The mirror had claimed the Harper family, and it would not let them go. As they climbed the stairs, the crying grew louder, more desperate, more demanding. And Eleanor realized with growing horror that the sound was not just crying, it was calling. The 3 fragments upstairs were being summoned home, back to the darkness that had created them, back to the mirror that held their true nature. When they reached the main floor, they found Constance Harper standing in the hallway. She was holding all 3 babies at once, though that should have been impossible. Her arms seemed to stretch and bend in ways that defied anatomy. She was walking toward the cellar door with slow, measured steps, Her eyes were completely black. Thomas lunged toward his wife, but she turned and looked at him with a smile that belonged to someone else entirely. "They must return," she said in a voice that echoed with 3 distinct tones. "They must become whole again. The mirror calls them home." Eleanor watched in terror as Constance descended the cellar steps. The babies in her arms had stopped crying. They were smiling now. All 3 identical smiles. All 3 pairs of eyes fixed on the darkness below. And Eleanor knew that whatever came back up those stairs would not be human. 3 days passed without a sign from the Harper household, and the people of Cardington began to whisper of curses and devils. Reverend Michael Thorne stood at his pulpit on the morning of November 19, 1856, looking out at his congregation with growing unease. Half the usual families were missing. Those who had come kept glancing toward the windows as if expecting something terrible to appear. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the general store, had closed her doors after claiming she saw 3 identical children standing outside her shop window at midnight, all 3 pressing their pale hands against the glass. All 3 smiling. Sheriff William Douglas had ridden out to the Harper farm twice but found no one home. The house stood empty, but smoke still rose. From the chimney, food sat half-eaten on the kitchen table. The baby's cradle was gone. But strangest of all was the smell, a sweet, cloying scent that seemed to come from the very walls, like flowers left too long in a closed room, like something beautiful that had begun to rot. Eleanor Blackwood had not slept since her encounter in the cellar. She sat by her kitchen window watching the path that led to the Harper farm, waiting for something she could not name. On the evening of November 20th, her vigil was rewarded. 3 figures emerged from the tree line walking in perfect step. At first she thought they were children, but as they drew closer she realized they were something else entirely. They had grown. The babies born just 5 days ago were now the size of 5-year-olds. Their faces were still identical, but they had aged with supernatural speed. All 3 wore the same simple white dress. All 3 had the same long, dark hair. All 3 moved with the same inhuman grace. Eleanor grabbed her shawl and followed them, keeping to the shadows. The 3 figures walked through Cardington without making a sound, their bare feet seeming to glide above the ground. They stopped at the home of Jacob Morrison. One of them placed a small hand against his front door. Within moments, Eleanor heard Jacob scream a sound of pure terror that cut through the night like a blade. The 3 figures moved on to the next house, and the next. At each stop, they would touch the door. At each stop, the screaming would begin. Eleanor realized with growing horror what was happening. They were collecting something, taking something from each home. She crept closer to the Morrison house and peered through the window. Jacob lay on his kitchen floor, perfectly still. His wife, Mary, knelt beside him, shaking him, trying to wake him, but his eyes stared at nothing. His face bore an expression of absolute terror, and his hair had gone completely white. Eleanor understood then what the 3 children were taking. They were harvesting, fear feeding on terror, growing stronger with each house they visited. She had to warn the others, had to find a way to stop this nightmare before it consumed the entire town. But as she turned to run, she found herself face to face with all 3 children. They had appeared behind her without making a sound. Up close, she could see that their eyes held the same ancient intelligence she had witnessed in the newborns. But now there was something else. Hunger. One of them spoke in a voice that sounded like wind. "Through dead leaves, Eleanor Blackwood, you have seen too much." Another child smiled, showing teeth that were too sharp, too white. "You know what we are?" The 3rd child tilted her head in a gesture that was almost human. "You helped bring us into this world. Now, you must help us complete our purpose." Eleanor tried to run, but her legs would not obey her. The children began to circle her slowly, their bare feet making no sound on the cobblestones. They were beautiful and terrible, innocent and evil, young and impossibly old. As they moved, the shadows seemed to follow them, wrapping around Eleanor like chains. She felt her strength draining away, her memories becoming cloudy, her will to resist fading. This is what they had done to Jacob Morrison. This is what they were doing to the entire town. One by one, they were stealing the very essence of life from anyone who encountered them. Growing stronger, growing more real, growing into something that could exist independently of the mirror that had created them. Eleanor used the last of her strength to whisper a single word. "Constance, where is she?" The three children stopped circling. Their identical faces showed the same cold smile. "She gave us form." One of them said. "She gave us flesh," another continued. "She gave us purpose." The third finished. "Now she sleeps in the place between mirrors, in the space where broken souls go to heal." Eleanor felt herself falling, though her feet had not moved. The world around her was growing dark, but with her final conscious thought she understood the terrible truth. Constance Harper was not dead. She was trapped in whatever realm existed behind the mirror. And these three creatures wearing the faces of children were not her babies. They were something else, something that had used her body as a doorway into the world, something that would not stop feeding until every soul in Cardington belonged to them, as darkness claimed her. Eleanor heard the sound of footsteps, more people coming, more victims for the three children to harvest, and she knew that by morning the town of Cardington would be nothing but empty houses and white-haired corpses, all staring at nothing, all wearing the same expression of absolute terror. Dr. Samuel Whitmore returned to Cardington on November 22, 1856, with a leather satchel full of books and a heart heavy with terrible knowledge. The town he found was not the one he had left. Empty streets stretched before him like the pathways of a graveyard. Doors hung open on silent hinges. Windows stared blindly at the gray November sky. The only sound was the wind rustling through abandoned gardens. He had spent 3 days in Columbus researching everything he could find about mirror magic and soul division, ancient texts that most doctors would dismiss as superstition. Accounts from European folklore about spirits that could split themselves into multiple forms. Indigenous stories about cursed reflections that trapped souls between worlds. What he had learned chilled him to the bone, but it also gave him hope. The three entities were not invincible. They were fragments, incomplete pieces of something larger, and fragments could be reunited, could be made whole, could be sent back to where they came from. He made his way through the deserted town, noting the bodies he found in some houses, all dead, all bearing the same expression of terror, all with hair turned white as winter snow. The three creatures had fed well, grown strong, but they had also grown careless. At the Harper farmhouse he found what he was looking for. The front door stood wide open. The smell of decay hung in the air like a funeral shroud, and from somewhere deep beneath the house came the sound of singing. Three young voices harmonizing in a language that predated human speech. Dr. Whitmore lit his lamp and descended into the cellar. The mirror was exactly as Eleanor Blackwood had described it, a massive rectangle of dark glass that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. But now he could see more clearly what it really was. Not a mirror at all, but a window, a doorway between this world and somewhere else. Somewhere darker. The three children stood before it with their backs to him. They had continued to grow. Now they appeared to be about 10 years old. Their white dresses had lengthened to accommodate their new height. Their hair flowed down their backs like black water. They were singing to something on the other side of the glass. Something that was singing back. Dr. Whitmore opened his leather satchel and removed the items he had brought: a silver cross blessed by 7 different ministers' salt from the shores of Lake Erie, a fragment of iron from a meteorite, and most importantly, a small hand mirror wrapped in black cloth. The children stopped singing. All 3 turned to face him at the same moment. Their eyes had changed, no longer dark but reflecting light like polished silver. Dr. Samuel Whitmore said, "The one in the center. You have returned. We wondered when you would come back to us." Said the second. "You cannot stop what has already begun," said the third. Dr. Whitmore unwrapped the small mirror. According to the texts he had read, fragments of a divided soul would always be drawn back together, if presented with their original reflection. The children saw what he held, and their expressions changed. For the first time since he had witnessed their birth, they showed fear. "You do not understand what you are doing." The first child said, "We are more than what we were." The second added, "We are becoming something new." The third finished. Dr. Whitmore raised the small mirror so that it faced the large, dark window. The effect was immediate. The children began to scream. Not the cry of human babies, but something far worse. A sound like glass breaking, like reality, tearing like the end of the world. Their forms began to waver, to become translucent. In the large mirror he could see another reflection appearing. A woman with auburn hair and kind eyes, Constance Harper, trapped behind the glass, reaching toward the three fragments of what had once been her unborn child. The children fought against the pull, their forms solidifying, then fading, then solidifying again, but Dr. Whitmore held the mirror steady, and slowly, painfully, the three began to move toward their reflection, toward the woman who waited behind the glass, toward reunion, toward wholeness, toward an end to the nightmare they had created. As they were drawn into the mirror, their screams grew louder, more desperate, more human, and Dr. Whitmore realized with dawning horror that they were not just fragments of a soul. They were fragments of an innocent child, a child who had been split apart before birth, who had been twisted by forces beyond understanding, who had become monsters not by choice but by the cruel mathematics of broken magic. The last thing he saw before the mirror went dark was Constance Harper holding a single baby whole and complete, and finally at peace. Then the glass shattered, and silence fell over the Harper farmhouse like snow. The official report, filed by Sheriff William Douglas on November 30th, 1856, stated that the Harper family had died of cholera, the same disease that claimed the other 47 residents of Cardington, who were found dead in their homes during the last week of November. Dr. Samuel Whitmore signed the death certificates, buried the bodies in unmarked graves, and ordered the Harper farmhouse burned to the ground. The basement was filled with concrete. The land was declared unfit for habitation. By spring of 1857, the town of Cardington had been abandoned. The few survivors moved away, changed their names, never spoke of what they had witnessed. But Dr. Whitmore kept a journal, hidden in a locked drawer of his desk, written in a cipher that only he could read. In it he recorded the truth that could never be told, the truth about mirrors that showed more than reflections, the truth about souls that could be divided, the truth about the price of trying to look too deeply into the spaces between worlds. On his deathbed in 1889, he gave the journal to his son with specific instructions. "Burn this," he whispered. "Never let anyone read what I have written. Never let them know what really happened in Cardington." His son obeyed. The journal was reduced to ash, the truth buried with the man who had witnessed it. But some knowledge refuses to stay buried. Some mirrors cannot be broken. Some reflections continue to exist long after the original has been destroyed. 1923, a construction crew, working on a new railroad line through what had once been Cardington, made an unusual discovery. Buried beneath 6 feet of soil and concrete, they found the remains of a basement, and in that basement, covered in nearly 70 years of dust and debris, they found fragments of a large mirror, black glass scattered across the dirt floor. The crew supervisor ordered the fragments collected and disposed of, but one piece, a shard about the size of a man's hand, went missing, found its way into the pocket of a young worker named James Mackenzie. James took the fragment home to his wife Sarah. She was pregnant with their first child, due to give birth in the winter months. Sarah loved to look at her reflection, loved to imagine what their baby would look like. She kept the black mirror fragment on her dressing table, used it to check her appearance each morning, and sometimes late at night when sleep would not come, she would hold the fragment up to the lamplight and whisper to her unborn child, telling it stories, sharing her dreams, describing the life they would have together. On December 15th, 1923, Sarah Mackenzie went into labor. The birth was difficult, longer than expected, but eventually she delivered 3 identical baby girls, all born within minutes of each other, all bearing the same crescent-shaped birthmark behind their left ears, all breathing in perfect synchronization. The attending doctor, a young man fresh out of medical school, had never seen anything like it. He wrote in his report that the mother insisted she had only been carrying one child, that she had felt only one baby moving, that this was impossible. But there they were, 3 perfect identical children, as if they had been carved from the same piece of living marble. The doctor kept that report in his files for the rest of his career, never understanding what he had witnessed. never knowing the history of the land where the Mackenzie family lived, never realizing that he had documented the return of something that had been waiting patiently for the right moment, for the right mirror, for the right family, to begin again. The three Mackenzie girls grew up healthy and normal. Married men from neighboring towns had children of their own. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon was dark, neighbors would report seeing three identical women standing at the edge of the woods, all wearing the same white dress, all moving with the same inhuman grace, all watching, all waiting, all remembering what they had once been and what they might become again. The mirror fragments were scattered, but mirrors can be rebuilt, souls can be divided, and some hungers never truly die. They only sleep and wait and dream of the day they will feed once more in the hills of Ohio, where the soil remembers everything and nothing stays buried forever. The end.